So today I'm briefly going to be talking about an initiative called the Swiss Benin Initiative, and the manner in which contested collections, museum collections, are being addressed in Switzerland. But before I start, who among us has seen Black Panther, the blockbuster?
No.
And any of you? Okay, a recommendation. I saw Black Panther. It's one of the Marvel films in 2018 in a really packed cinema in Cotonou in Benin Republic. And I think, like many viewers, I was taken in by the aesthetical proposal, the Afrofuturism of this blockbuster, of its political messaging, of the way it kind of embedded a whole stream of Black intellectual thought within it. But there was one particular scene that really kind of enraged the cinema. It's a moment in the film, kind of midway through, where a robber goes into a museum that's kind of posed as the British Museum. It's not. It's called the Museum of Great Britain or something like that. And he starts interrogating the curator about the origin of the collections, especially the Benin collections. And he asks her, how do you think your ancestors got these? Do you think they paid a fair price, or did they just take them like they took everything else? And in this moment in the film, the audience in that packed cinema in West Africa literally exploded. People stood up, they started clapping, they started laughing, they started patting each other on the back, and the energy was just so tangible. And this is a moment where I realized, okay, these questions about restitution, about museum collections, these aren't specific to a profession, to a niche, to a circle of kind of academic elite discussion. These have become really societal questions that really mean something for young West Africans today, and are seen as part of a process of decolonization that hasn't occurred yet. Following this, I moved back to Europe and started, after my PhD, to work for the Benin Initiative Schweiz. So the Benin Initiative Schweiz, or the Swiss Benin Initiative, is an initiative concerned with collections from the Kingdom of Benin in Nigeria. And you just have an orange dot where the Kingdom of Benin is there in West Africa, not to be confused with the country Benin. It's kind of tricky. The neighboring country of Nigeria is called La République du Benin. So we're talking about current day Nigeria. And one of the objectives of the Swiss Benin Initiative is to exactly improve this relationship here, so that it's not a deaf dialogue that it's occurring here, but to really listen to different perspectives about these objects, and as curators to open up to other potential futures for these objects outside of museums. This is occurring in a moment in Switzerland where there are many debates, a lot of thinking, a lot of thought process going on around what does it mean to have a colonial past if you haven't officially had colonies, but were nonetheless engaged with the colonial endeavor. The Swiss were engaged as merchants, as missionaries, as mercenaries. I often try and think of it as like the kind of 3 M's. For example, here on the right, Joseph Zweifel, who was active in West Africa at the moment of the looting of the Benin Bronzes. A few kind of entry points to that: a special edition in the Anthropology Journal in Santa 2019, discussing decolonial processes in academia, but also in cultural institutions. Then the work of Puchat and Tine on colonial Switzerland, so rethinking colonialism from the margins. And I think Denis might touch on this later. And this is very much a discussion that's occurring at the moment as well. So Swiss colonialism is on the agenda for next year, 2014. The National Museum here, the Landesmuseum in Zurich, will be having an exhibition on the topic. The Muséum d'Ethnographie in Genève, so the Ethnographic Museum in Geneva, and the French-speaking part will also have a focus on this question in their collections, as well as upcoming exhibitions at the Museum Heidelberg. A conversation that's happening so in academia, in museums, and also in public space. Here on the right, you see an intervention from the artist Matthias Pund, rethinking the heritage of David de Pury, one of the big donators of the city of Neuchâtel. This is also happening at a moment in Switzerland where Swiss museum publics are questioning their consumption, cultural consumption. They want that consumption to be ethical, just as we want to buy ethical food, ethical clothes. And this is coming out not just in colonial collections, but also in collections connected to World War II and spoliations during that time. For example, the big exhibition in Bern around the Görlitz collections. So in this context, 8 museums in Switzerland came together to form a network in order to investigate their colonial collections from Benin City. And you see the museums here. These are museums with different profiles. A lot of them have ethnographic collections. However, some of them are also just art museums. We have historical museums. They also belong to different levels of governance, which is an interesting question when it comes to restitution. Some belong to cities, to cantons, others to foundations. Here you see the number of pieces from Benin City, not necessarily looted pieces, also non-looted pieces from Benin City in these collections. And yes, I mean, what I see when I look at this is that actually the collections in Switzerland are very small. You have to think that in the British Museum, you have around 900 pieces from Benin, in Berlin, 600 pieces. So these are actually very small collections in Switzerland, which means the stakes are somehow lower as well. And here you see just a quick graphic that shows what these collections are made up of. So there are commemorative heads, plaques, bells, elephant tusks. We won't be going into the details of the actual pieces, but you have a range of typologies that is kind of representative of pieces of collections in other museums worldwide. Okay, so the Kingdom of Benin, what happened there? Kingdom of Benin, very powerful kingdom during the 15th, 16th century, especially under the reign of this monarch, Wari II. Very interesting urban structure. So he erected walls. This is a city that was built on the basis of fractal architecture and urban planning. Visitors to this city compared it in a positive light to Amsterdam or to Lisbon. This is also one of the first cities where there's documented street lighting. So an interesting urban space where the kingdom was incredibly important. Incredibly important also because they were trading with the Portuguese and were strong agents in this trading. Also slave traders themselves, so they acquired funds through selling slaves to Portugal in exchange for manillas. We'll get back to that later. In 1897, the British troops seeking to expand their colonial power in Nigeria attacked the city of Benin. We don't have time to go into the details of that, but in a nutshell, this is a very asymmetric battle that occurs. The British military is testing automatic weaponry at this point. It's a time when the Empire of Benin, the Kingdom of Benin, is in decline as well. British soldiers attack the city, burn the palaces of the city are burnt down, and around 10,000 objects are looted from the city, especially from the palace grounds. These pieces are looted individually by soldiers and also through organized looting by the generals. These pieces will go back to the British government and be resold. The objects in question find their way onto the international art market and into public and private collections worldwide, including Switzerland. So what we're trying to do today is to establish which of the Benin pieces in the collections of Switzerland were looted in 1897. It's a very key date for us. And how are we doing that? Working through archives, looking at the objects themselves. Often the objects hold a kind of forensics of whether they were present in that battle or not. They also, for example, will have numbers on them from different museums, so we're able to trace through that. But also working with partners in Nigeria, be that the descendants of the people who made these objects in guilds today, local academics, museum professionals, and most importantly, here on the photo on the right, you see in the middle in yellow, Michaela Oberhofer, Africa curator of the Museum Riedberg, and to her right, Esther Teaser, provenance researcher at the Museum Riedberg. These are the two founders, leaders of the project. And then to the left, my colleague, Enibokun Uzébu, doctor historian at the University of Benin, and who from the beginning has been implicated in the research. So we've been working as a duo, both in the archives in Europe, conducting interviews here, but also through oral history in Nigeria. And that's kind of new for provenance research, to have this collaborative, multi kind of perspective approach from the beginning. It means also that we shift from just looking at written evidence, or what we would consider evidence from a European perspective, to embedding other forms of knowledge into our understanding of those objects and where they originally came from within the project. Key here is always kind of this political analysis, also trying to understand what this means from a Swiss perspective. What kind of work is a project doing like this in the Swiss debates, thinking about colonialism, but also, of course, to keep in mind how Nigeria approaches these collections and what does this mean in Nigeria. And here, for example, you see the article, Egypt to help Nigeria preserve looted Benin Bronzes. What does this remind us? It reminds us that this is also about South to South connections. It's not just about a discussion between the North and the South, but new opportunities that go in many directions. We also understand that Nigerian perspective isn't just one perspective. Of course, there's a multiplicity of actors as everywhere, and we have been working both with the state, so the National Commission of Museum and Monuments, you see his director, Dr. Abbas Tijani, in the middle there, and with the Royal Palace in Benin City, and there you have the Oba Ewari II, in our first audience with His Royal Highness. Why is this important? Because, of course, in all the decolonial context, you have several levels of governance, the governance that was imposed through the colonial project, and traditional local governance that remains relevant and legitimate in Benin culture. So important for us to be working with both actors. And there are other actors there as well. To the left, the Legacy Restoration Trust, who is in the process of proposing a new museum, the local state governor, or actors such as the Restitution Study Group, a group from the American diaspora who are themselves against restitution for different reasons. So part of this project is really trying to keep track of these different interests and remain aware from them, not to have a kind of block, this is one Nigerian position, but to remain sensitive to that. We're also very aware in the project that there's nothing new about these restitution debates. For example, the first restitution requests from Benin City, not to Switzerland, but to Germany, came from the Oba Akinzua, the King Akinzua, in 1936. So this is a discussion that's been going on for a long time, that has taken various forms, especially around the moment of independence, where there was a moment of possibility of the return of the Benin Bronzes that didn't occur for different reasons. But then also recently, there's been a kind of new energy embedded into debates about restitution, prompted in part by the study by the Senegalese philosopher Felwine Sarr and the French-German intellectual Bénédicte Savoy in 2018, study commissioned by Macron, but also various movements of restitution occurring in the UK and in Germany. So of course this is a Swiss story, but it's a Swiss story that's embedded amongst a kind of an international context that is of course much wider than Switzerland. If you look at the moments where these objects enter into the Swiss collection, there's something quite specific about Switzerland, is that they come much later. Whereas museums in Berlin, in the UK, will be acquiring Benin Bronzes pretty much straight after the military attack, so 1897, end of the 19th century, let's say. In Switzerland, they come much later. So there's a first acquisition that happens by the Museum of Basel directly after the attack. But then it's only in 1941 that there's the kind of second peak you see there. Why does that happen? That happens because a Swiss collector called Han Korai, who had a big Benin collection, goes bankrupt. His collection is seized by Credit Suisse and then resold into Swiss museums. So it's a very Swiss story in that the acquisition of this collection is entangled with the Swiss banking sector. Really nothing new there to report back on. The third peak is in 1962. An interesting story as well. This is when the director of the Museum of Neuchâtel, Jean Gabu, who at the time is working as a UNESCO consultant on various museum projects, travels to West Africa and acquires a series of pieces. At this time, this is a moment where the Museum of Neuchâtel only has one Benin bronze. And at this time, really, to be a proper ethnographic museum, you have to have a Benin collection. It was kind of like if you had to tick off your lists of what was acquired for a full ethnographic collection, then the Benin Bronzes were definitely on that list. So he acquires at this moment 17 pieces. Interestingly, though, these are all modern pieces. So they're not pieces that were looted in 1897. The question occurs, was the intention there or the aspiration to buy officially looted pieces or not? In any case, somehow Neuchâtel is off the hook due to that purchase that occurred in 1962. And then a last point, the last knowingly acquired piece that was looted in 1897 that enters into a Swiss museum collection is 2011. So 2011 is very late to be acquiring looted art from 1897. I don't think any museum today would acquire pieces as such. But at the time, this is quite recent, right? 2011, this is seen as a form of authenticity. So when you read the annual report with the purchase of this piece, it's seen as a sign that this is an original old piece and not as a sign that this is ethically problematic. So it's interesting also how, despite the fact that this is an ongoing debate, an ongoing discussion that's been happening for a long time, there has actually been quite a recent shift in museums' appreciation and understanding of Benin collections. After spending a year working on this project with my colleague Enibokun Uzébu, we decided to establish 4 categories. The idea is that our research results are decision-making tools as well. So we were able to identify 21 objects that were looted, definitely looted in 1897, 32 that were likely to have been looted in 1897. These are pieces where we don't have a paper trail that links it, for example, to a soldier who was present at the battle, but where from the aesthetical perspective, looking at the object itself, we are pretty sure that it was present in the palace at the time of looting. We then have objects, 16, that's the light green, that are unlikely to have been looted. For example, pieces where museums purchased them thinking maybe they were older, but looking at the objects with specialists from Benin today, the quality doesn't fit, or certain things where we think it probably was produced a little bit later. And the last category, these are objects that we're sure were not looted in 1897. These are definitely objects that have been produced later. Of course, what this doesn't do is also give us details about contexts of unfair acquisition that happened during the colonial period. And of course, this is happening as well, right? This graphic is really just 1897. It doesn't tell us about those post-colonial, potentially unethical acquisitions. So here you have an example of all of these categories, and I'm just going to tell you the story of one piece. This is the first piece. This is the one piece that Neuchâtel had before that 1963 trip that Jean Gabu made. And I think I'm about halfway through my time. I can talk until like 3:40-ish, right, Maria? Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so we have 20 minutes with this plaque. Let's go. Before I go further, yeah, sorry, before we go to the plaque, this is interesting. This is the graphic of how these pieces are split among the museums, in terms of which ones are problematic or not. And so, for example, the Neuchâtel, the one in the middle, you can see that this one plaque is the deep red and the rest is green, the ones that are more recent acquisitions, whereas Basel MKB has lots of pieces that were looted in 1897. So not all museums, of course, ended up with the same results at the end of this project. You know, some have definitely more contested collections than others. Okay, so this plaque, this is a metal plaque. It's about 40 centimeters high, 20 centimeters wide, like this. It's in 3D, and it's made through the technique of cire perdu, or the lost wax casting technique, produced in the 16th century. And it represents a Portuguese soldier. You know, I mentioned earlier that the Benin community was trading a lot with the Portuguese. So there are many representations of Portuguese figures within Benin art. You can see this plaque appears in a catalogue by Lushan, a real expert of Benin pieces in Germany in 1919. And what you will note as a visual folk is that the plaque in the meantime has been cut off around the corners to make it smarter. This is a little problematic because the sides of the plaques are actually really useful for dating. So you can see through a lot of transformations that happen in the art market that we lose information about the pieces. So this plaque would have been traded, or would have been made, sorry, through the brass manillas that the Portuguese used to purchase slaves. So this plaque in itself is really entangled with slavery, right? And that the material it's made of was a currency to buy slaves, and it's representing a Portuguese soldier who was the Portuguese being active in the slave trade. Interesting also, though, is this lotus detail on the back of the plaque. So this lotus detail tells us that this plaque has been kind of embedded within the local cosmology of the spirit of Olokun. So the spirit of Olokun, the kind of androgynous sea god figure that the Portuguese were associated with. So as a kind of, from a purely European perspective, we can look at that and say, okay, it's a Portuguese figure. From a Benin perspective, from a local perspective, we'd be saying, okay, this is also a godly figure, the godly Olokun figure. There are many plaques like this. Benin has one. The British Museum has many. This is the famous room of the Benin plaques in the British Museum. And there are many Portuguese figures as well. So these plaques, for example, will represent various features of Benin life. At one point, they were awning the walls of the palace. So they would have been represented on the as a kind of facade of images. It must have been incredibly striking at the time to see these kind of architectural components on the palace. At the time of looting, these plaques were found buried under they were kind of in storage in a depot, buried under the floor of the palace. The Portuguese figure comes back regularly in this plaque. So you see in the British Museum in Berlin, Boston. So there's one in Switzerland, but there are many other worldwide. So the first question we kind of asked ourselves and tried to establish is, how did this piece get from Benin City to Nigeria? So I guess this is the bread and butter of provenance work. What we know, what we establish, and this we always try and do, is to not have the first step. Often in provenance research, the first step is when it arrives in a European museum. Like that's the moment where we write we write down the history. So what we've tried to do is always kind of establish, okay, here would have been the maker. If we don't have the name, let's at least try and find the guild that would have produced this piece. So we know that this piece would have been produced in the 16th century by the Bronze Casters Guild. It would have been commissioned by the king, because only the king was allowed to commission bronze. So that makes it pretty clear that it was part of the king's ownership. It was then looted by the British Army in 1897. Interestingly, the British Army documents all of this. There are many photo albums. So there you see on the top photo, you actually see soldiers, and on the floor there you see the bronze, you see these plaques. So not specifically this plaque, but you see all of the plaques. And the photo at the bottom is also issued from a photo album, and there it's clearly written loot below it, right? So these are clearly pieces that are recognized by the British Army themselves as having been looted. The piece is then acquired in Nigeria. So there's a transaction that occurs before it even leaves Nigeria by the firm Heinrich B. and Co. Interesting, I mean, to me, very interesting, because Heinrich B. and Co. is one of the companies that lobbied the British Army to attack the kingdom. They lobbied it because the king in question was stopping free trade of natural commodities. So here you see how the extraction of natural commodities and the extraction of cultural goods happens kind of through the same partners. Heinrich B. will sell the piece to the Ethnographic Museum in Berlin. There you see it going into the Ethnographic Museum in 1898. And then the Ethnographic Museum, and this is also a kind of interesting point in that often an argument that's used against restitution is to say, yes, but once pieces enter into European or American museums, they're kind of safe. They won't go back onto the art market like they possibly could in Nigeria. But for example, in this example, you see that this piece does go through the museum in Berlin and then back onto the art market, because in 1923, in times of great inflation, the Berlin Museum will sell it to the art dealer called Alfred Speyer. We then had a real gap in the provenance until it was sold to the Ethnographic Museum in 1952. So we didn't really know what was happening between 1923 and 1952. And here, I tell no lie, this part of the presentation I've already given. And I gave this bit of the presentation about this little plaque in Neuchâtel to a room of curator folks in Basel at the end of last year. And after the talk, a woman came up to me, Claudia Deng, and she said, I think I know where that plaque was between 1923 and 1952. So she works for a different project. She's not on colonial heritage. She works for the Morse Art Research Initiative in Germany, that's investigating the collections of the Morse family, a Jewish family of collectors in Berlin whose artwork was seized by the Nazis and sold under pressure. And it so happened that Morse had a collection of Benin plaques, including a plaque that very much resembles this plaque here. So this was interesting. So together we followed up this lead, and we were able to verify those things. That yes, it's pretty sure that Alfred Speyer, so the art dealer, sold this piece to the Morse family. And this is where it gets complicated. And this is where there's, I'm afraid, a chunk of text, because otherwise I forget the dates. So what happens is the piece is acquired by the Morse family and then sold at auction under pressure from the Nazi regime in 1934. Okay, so who buys that piece in 1934 when these plaques go on sale? Interestingly, another Jewish dealer, a Jewish collector called Friedrich Wolf Knies, who then purchases these pieces. He's based in Vienna, takes the pieces to Vienna, and then 1941, it happens again. The Gestapo seizes again the same plaque and confiscates it, and it's transferred to the Ethnographic Museum, so the Völkerkunde Museum in Vienna. After the war, the Allies return this piece to Knies. So in 1947, they're restituted to Friedrich Wolf Knies. And when he dies, it's probably inherited by his spouse, who then sells off the collection. So then we get to 1949, which is quite close to 1952 when this piece goes. So this, I mean, this piece raises lots of questions, right? In that it's been seized several times. When it was looted by the Gestapo in Germany, by the Gestapo in Vienna, and it's been restituted once before. It also opens up new conversations about solidarity between different actors, between actors involved in post-colonial restitution and those involved in post-World War II restitution. Why are these plaques so important for the people of Benin? In part because they're the archives of Benin City, right? Whereas we consider our archives often to be in paper form, the bronze casters of Benin City cast these pieces in bronze to remember certain events, to remember certain moments. And I will now briefly show you a video, of course, with her permission, made of the Professor Igafona, who, yeah, dear colleague, we met, this was taken when we met in March of last year. And I hope that the sound works. There are subtitles if it doesn't.
Do you guys hear anything?
Sorry, can you hear?
No, I think the sound is going into your headphones. So maybe if you disconnect them, we can hear the sound. Otherwise, we're just seeing the subtitles.
Otherwise, I just leave you with the subtitles then, because it's nearly finished. So
no problem. Yeah.
Okay, so what I find interesting with the propos of Concure is that she sees restitution not as a kind of like an end point, but as a starting point for knowledge production about these pieces from the South. So it's really in that it's a decolonial process in her eyes. One thing that she has been working on herself is digital Benin. So she's principal investigator of this project to build a digital database that would bring together all of these pieces. So here you see, for example, all of the Swiss pieces. But of course, we're aware that the digital solutions are not enough, right? In January of this year, we welcomed a delegation of palace members, government members, academics, and artists to Switzerland in order to discuss the future of these collections and future collaborations with museum staff and directors. We all came together for one day of a day's workshop where we had the task to draft a common declaration. And this is interesting in that it's not a Swiss position. It's a common declaration about that conversation that's happening between Switzerland and Nigeria. This declaration was authored by the 30 people you see there. And only I leave you just the two first articles. So the first being that the ownership of these objects that were looted or likely to have been looted, so like completely sure or almost sure. So there's a change of the burden of evidence that occurs in that wording. In 1897 should return to the original owners, and the participating museums were open to a transfer of ownership of these objects. And I can't read that last line because it's the Zoom box, but you can read it. this is about the future of the collections. It's also about future collaborations, be that exchanges between curators and academics. The next stage of this project will work on that political question of restitution, but also the project will continue in terms of thinking about outreach. How do we communicate these results? How do we provide context for those object trajectories? And how do we develop future collaborations of cooperation, new methodologies of cooperation between Swiss museums and African curators. I will stop here. For more information, everything's up on the Museum Rietberg website. That's our main website for this project. Thank you very much for your attention. 3:41. I'm almost on time, Maria.